Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Let's Talk About, the podcast where we talk about all kinds of crazy shit. As I promised in the last episode, I'm going to be talking about democracy this week, which sounds incredibly fun and not at all serious and boring, promise you. So, the reason why I want to talk about democracy is because there is this feeling in the Western world at the moment that the world is going a bit crazy. That doesn't necessarily mean it's becoming worse or becoming better. It's just going a bit. It's a bit unpredictable. There's a lot of things that are happening that it's hard to understand why they're happening. It's hard to follow what's going to happen next, and there's just so many stories that come out every day that an extra crazy thing has happened that's just confused everything and made everything more complicated. And I'm from the UK, so for me it's Brexit and the general political climate between the two main parties. And then in America, it's obviously Trump, and the same thing really, just the massive disparity between the two parties and the tribalism that's going on between each position, both the people who hate Trump and the people who love Trump. And the thing that all these things have in common is that democracy put them there. So Brexit and Trump were both put there as a result of democracy. And a lot of the things that have happened since then have been a result of democracy as well. And yet, everyone is incredibly divided. Half the country is absolutely miserable and hates what's going on. And the other half is still miserable, still thinks there's tons of problems, but they think their side is going to solve it. So what has this got to do with democracy that I want to talk about? So the idea behind democracy is that you give the people in a society the power to rule over themselves, so they have autonomy over their own decisions and the things that happen to them. And if there's a government, which most people, there's only a few fringe people that think there should be no government at all, but most people believe that there should be a government. But the government should be controlled by democracy. So in other words, a government should make the decisions on how to run the country, but that government should be controlled by democracy, controlled by the people in the society. And that sounds really good in practice, because who doesn't want control over their own life when you're doing your day-to-day activities? Of course you want control over your own life. You want to decide where you go to do your shopping, what you do for the day, who you spend your life with, things like that. So the idea of democracy to the vast majority of people is obviously, it's just the obvious thing to do. But the problem is, and this is the main point of this episode, democracy doesn't work. So anyone hearing that might be incredibly offended, or just think I'm an idiot, or just have like a gut reaction, just like, what the fuck are you talking about? But if we step back just a little bit and then actually try and figure out why we want democracy and what we're trying to achieve through democracy, it's quite obvious to see that it has a massive fatal flaw in it. So let's take a very simple example so we can demonstrate democracy in its perfect form, I guess. Democracy when it's working as intended, and then compare that to democracy as it works in the real world. So let's say you're an individual in a group of 10 people and you're walking down a road, and then you get to a point in the road where it splits off into two paths. You can either go left or right, and then you can see down the road, and down the left path you can see it just goes off a cliff, and you look down the right path and you can see it goes to the city or wherever you want to go, goes to a safe place. So you've got left path, bad, right path, good. So when you reach that spot on the road, you've decided you want to do democracy, so all 10 of you get to pick which way you go. So all of you are people and you all want to survive. You've all set off on this journey wanting to get to that place, the city or the safe place, wherever it is. So all of you look at the information at hand and you say, okay, great, we can see down the left path that that's a dead end, and we can see down the right path that it's where we want to go. Everyone can see that information, and then everyone takes a vote, and because it's incredibly clear which is the right way to go, 10 out of 10 people vote for the right path. They all have a self-interest to be alive, to get where they're going, so they all vote for the right path. That's a scenario where democracy works great, because in an alternative system, say like a dictatorship, you might have one of the people is the dictator, and then 9 other people just have to follow what the dictator says, else they get punished. The dictator might have an incentive to not want the other 9 people to reach the place where they're going, because maybe there's some kind of wealth there that only the dictator wants. But maybe the dictators needed them other 9 people so far to keep the car running, or however, just for labour basically. But now they've got to close enough that they can see it. The dictator decides, no, you guys, you can go off that left way, and if you come down the right way, I'm going to kill you, but I'm going to go down the right way. And in that scenario, obviously, democracy works better. We've compared the 2 scenarios, and in dictatorship, 9 people die even though they know that they're going down the wrong path. They've been ordered to go down the wrong path. That's dictatorship, and in democracy, all 10 people survive, and it's a free choice. They've all decided that freely. So obviously, that works. So that's in a theoretical, hypothetical world. But the problem is that doesn't exist at all, even in places where there is relatively decent democracy. So if we compare the UK with Russia, for example, I'm from the UK and I have no reason to believe that my vote doesn't go to the correct place, as in it doesn't get counted. But in Russia, there would be reason to believe that either your vote isn't counted or someone is stuffing the ballot for the opposition and that kind of thing. So both countries have a democracy, but even England, where the democracy is pretty good by other standards, by other countries' standards, it's still nowhere near the perfect representation of democracy that I explained in the story a second ago. And the reason for this is because democracy only works when everyone in the voting population has the correct information. And to illustrate this, I'll tell the story of the path that the 10 people were going down. I'll tell that story again, but in a twisted situation where some of the people haven't got the right information. So, say you have the same thing again, 10 people going down a road, the left path leads to dead end or death, and the right path is to where you're going. Previously, they all could just see with their eyes that the right path was the correct one to go down, so they all chose that right way. But let's take 2 separate scenarios now. So imagine in the first scenario, out of the 10 people, 6 of them just decide, I'm not even going to bother looking which is the right path. I'm not going to learn. I'm not going to learn this information. I'm just going to carry on playing on my phone, talking to each other, and then when someone asks me what my vote is, I just think, oh well, left is my lucky direction, so I just choose left. And 6 out of the 10 people do that. They all choose left because they don't have the information through ignorance, or just they can't be bothered to learn. So there's 4 people who've tried to learn. They've looked down the right path, saw the correct direction, and they've been outvoted by people who are just ignorant. And in that system, that is democracy. 10 people have voted, and 60% have voted to go down the incorrect path. So the other 4 know that they are incorrect. The other 4 know that the other 6 are incorrect. But democracy is democracy, so they have to go down the left path. So you can see in that first scenario where, on paper, it's democracy, but the result is just objectively not good. All 10 people dying isn't good. Or even if it's not dying, even if it's just you go down the path, realise it's a dead end, and then have to backtrack, you still have made the wrong decision. You tried to make a decision at that crossroads of which one to go down in order to reach your goal, and you chose the wrong decision through democracy, and the consequences of that happened. So that's scenario 1, where clearly democracy didn't produce the best result. So scenario 2 is where there's 10 people again, and it turns out one of them has an incentive to send everyone down the left path. He's been told by someone else, someone outside of the group, that if you send everyone down the left path, then I'll rescue you, and then we'll rob the other 9 people, and then we'll share the belongings 50-50, and then we'll go to the city. So you as an individual reach your goal, the other 9 won't, but you'll get more reward for it. You'll get their belongings and you get to the city. So that person, that 10th person that's got this incentive, he could try and just do it by force, similar to a dictatorship, just threaten everyone and just say get down there or else. But everyone is aware of what that is. Everyone knows that's authoritarian, it's a dictatorship of some type, it's a tyrant. People won't go along with that willingly. So if the guy's clever, he'll stick with democracy because he knows that's what the other 9 people want to do. And what he'll do is he'll make the other people in the group doubt that what they're seeing with their own eyes might not be true. So they could do something like, they could say, oh, these 2 of the group, they're trying to trick you by saying that the right path is the path to go down, but I heard them in the pub earlier that they've got some kind of plan to trap you on the way there. I know it's a weird thing describing it in this story where it's almost like fucking highway robbery or something, but the point is that this 10th person could set these other 9 people against each other to create doubt. So some of them might see through this and see, no, it's obviously the right path, I'm going to go down there, and try and convince the others that it's a lie. But some of them might fall for it and choose to go down the left path. And then the person with this incentive, all he needs is that little bit of doubt, and then he can keep creating more and confuse people more, and then people don't know what to believe because they can see in front of them that the place where they want to go is the right path, but there's another 4 people saying, no, Joey and Bob are trying to trick us, we need to go down the left path because if we go down the right path we might die or get hurt. And if the guy is really clever, then he'll do something like he will take advantage of human nature and dynamics within the group. So human nature is that we are suspicious of people that we don't know, or we are suspicious of people who aren't the same culture as us, and then also we hold grudges and things like that. So when this person is trying to figure out how to divide the group, he could do it by saying, oh, these 2 people here, they're very quiet and they are new to the group and they're not from here. That's easier than trying to create suspicion between 2 people who've known each other for a long time and already have like a rapport. So the point of all this, the goal, is that the guy wants to make the majority of the people in that group vote for the left path because that benefits him. So that's his goal. And he does this by spreading misinformation, and that's what all of this is. So casting suspicion on the other members of the group, creating doubt between the group, creating divisions, all of that is for the purpose of creating misinformation. So the voters in that democracy of 10 people, are uninformed. So now when the vote is held, if that guy has done his job well enough, and the majority of people in that 10 people group have voted to go down the left path, then he's got what he's wanted. He's been successful. But for the other 9 people, they've obviously not been successful. They still want to go down the right path to get to the place where they want to go. But they've, as a democracy, chose the wrong path because, just like the first scenario, they had the wrong information. In the first scenario, it was just ignorance. The 6 people just couldn't be bothered to look up the information. In that case, it was literally just looking up the road and seeing the information for themselves. They chose to be ignorant or didn't know how to learn the information, etc., etc. In this case, the problem is still being uninformed. So the 6 people who voted to go down the left path in scenario 2 were still uninformed, but the cause of that uninformity, if that's even a word, the cause of that uninformity was a malicious actor, I guess you can call it, someone else purposely trying to misinform those other people. So now we're in a bit of a tricky situation with democracy now, because I've explained 3 scenarios of democracy. The first one where it works perfectly, and then the other 2 where, given misinformation, whether purposeful or just being ignorant, democracy leads to a objectively bad outcome for the majority of people involved. And that last sentence that I just said, that's the whole point of the argument I'm trying to make. If the process of democracy leads to an objectively bad outcome for the majority of the population voting, then how is that a good thing? Just because the majority of people have had a say in something doesn't mean that it's objectively the best choice. And we understand this about other parts of our life, but we just can't seem to figure out how to make the connection. So for example, parents wouldn't let their kid have a say in things like where they're going to live, how they spend the money in the household, important decisions that affect everyone's life in that household. Like if the dad buys a sports car just because he wants one, that loss in money is going to affect the kid, but the kid doesn't have a say in that. And the reason for that is, most people understand the reason for that, and they'd say it's something like, oh well, the kid isn't grown up enough to make them kind of decisions, the kid doesn't know the responsibility of caring about money and things like that. So in short, the kid can't be expected to have a good enough understanding of finance and things like that to really come to a informed conclusion about how to spend money or make big decisions like that. And even in democratic elections, we have a minimum age requirement for voting, because we understand that people below that threshold might not have the correct understanding of the policies and politics to vote in an informed way. But despite all this, as soon as you reach that threshold in which you can vote, you can vote. There's no requirement to actually understand what you're voting about to be informed. There's no requirement even to make sure that what you're telling others is the truth. So you can spread lies as much as you want, and if people believe them and vote for them, that's still democracy, even though it leads to objectively a bad outcome. And even when it becomes less objective and a bit more subjective, so when it comes to things like choices of morality, the same argument can still be applied. So for example, in Brexit, when that was being campaigned for, I guess, the Brexit party, the ones who wanted to leave, who won eventually, they said during their campaign that they were going to give an extra 350 million to the NHS. So that's quite a left-leaning policy. So a lot of people on the left who would have previously been against leaving saw this lie and then said, okay, we'll vote that way. And that was literally just a lie. And it wasn't whether you give money or not to the NHS, that on its own isn't objectively good or bad. It's subjectively good or bad. So the people voting for leave in that case were saying, giving money to the NHS, in my opinion, is subjectively good, and they've told me that's what they're going to do, so I'm going to vote for that. But that was a lie. So the campaigners fed them people misinformation. Those people believed it, and they voted based on that misinformation. And that is perfectly valid. That's still democracy. They're allowed to do that and face no repercussions at all. So you can start to see now why democracy in reality doesn't work as well as it should do. That original scenario of the perfect democracy, it sounds great in theory, but it doesn't actually exist. The reality that does exist is the other 2 scenarios that I told afterwards, which both produce bad outcomes. And don't get me wrong, sometimes you can also get a good outcome. But the point is to illustrate that democracy is entirely controlled by those who control the flow of information. And if those who control the flow of information aren't the voting population, if they are a select few of the voting population, then that's not democracy. And someone might say now, hang on, democracy sometimes produces really good results. Sometimes it actually produces what the people want. So if 75% of the people voting want a certain thing and that gets voted for, then great, democracy's worked. But the problem with this is it makes the assumption that the reason why that thing that was good happened was directly because of democracy, when that's usually not the case. So for example, there was a study in America that showed that what the people actually wanted had zero effect, or almost zero effect, on what the politicians actually implemented. And this is the same as the example I gave earlier with Brexit, where people wanted to have the money that was going to the EU go to the NHS instead. So they voted based on that. So what they wanted was more money to go to the NHS. But because what they were told was a lie, that didn't actually happen. And another example is in America. I think it's 97% of people in America want background checks for guns, for people who buy guns in America. 97% of the people want that, but the politicians don't implement it. And you can argue that there hasn't actually been a vote on that, so it's somewhat not democracy, sort of, but the point is that there's been many polls on this, and 97% of the population want a thing. And if it was a democracy, then the government would at the very least say, okay, let's have a proper official vote on this, or let's reassess this because it's what the people want. But that doesn't happen. So how do you explain the things that happen that are good? The things that the government do that generally the majority of people are happy with? So sometimes, these good things do happen through democracy. So if a government gets in charge that isn't corrupt, is actually working for the people, then they will tend to generally listen to what the people want. But even that system is not 100% perfect, because what do you do when you have a well-meaning government in charge that wants the best of people, but people vote against their own interests, either because they're ignorant or some third party has influenced them in some way, whether it's like a foreign government, a wing of the media that's profit driven, something like that. Even if the politician has completely good intentions, it's difficult for them to say that the thing you just voted for, it's going to be bad for you, and I'm looking out for your best interests, so I'm going to ignore what you said that you wanted and just do the objectively better thing, which in some cases is the actual thing that they want, but because of misinformation or ignorance or something like that, they voted for the other side, not realising that that they were lied to or something. So sometimes democracy does actually lead to the better outcome, the thing that most of the population wants and is mostly objectively better for the people involved, but this is quite rare. Usually what you see making a big difference is activism. So activism basically is where you take the majority of the people who should be the voting population, and they put pressure on the minority that actually have power in a democracy. So remember when we said that those who control the flow of information actually have control of a democracy. So the majority of the voting population will put pressure on these people. That's activism, and they'll put pressure on them to do the things that the voting population actually want. So this does actually work, and we see this play out all the time. And I'm not saying activism is flawless. Sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes it even makes things worse because it'll create an opposition out of something that there was previously not an opposition for. But the credit that democracy gets for implementing things that the people want is usually credit that activism deserves, because it's usually activism that forces the politicians, the people in charge, to change their mind. And a lot of people might say, well, activism is democracy. It's like democracy in action. And yeah, you can say that. I kind of understand that argument. But the way that I believe democracy was intended to work was that there shouldn't need to be this extra step of activism in order to get politicians to do what we voted them in to do. If the voting population wants them to do a certain thing, and we voted them in based on that, they should do that thing. It shouldn't be the norm to have to constantly protest the government to do the thing that they promised that they would do. And protesting should always be an option, obviously, because no government is going to get it perfect, because they're people at the end of the day. They might misinterpret what you voted for, things might change over the time that they're in office, so there needs to be a way for, whilst the government is in their term of office, there needs to be a way for the people to voice their concerns about something, and that's done through protest, but that should be rare. Protesting and activism should be rare. The majority of the time, the government should automatically just do what the people want. They shouldn't need to be forced to do it. So yeah, activism is part of democracy. If you're using activism to implement the policies you want, then that's because democracy has failed. And lastly, another reason why sometimes good things will happen in democracy is just simply because the people who are in power want something, and that just happens coincidentally to line up with what the majority of people want. So for example, it doesn't matter which background you come from, the majority of people think murder is wrong, for example. There's very, very few people who think it should just be okay to run around killing people. So everyone, regardless of where you come from, would vote for that. And the people who control the flow of information, who really control democracy, they are the ones who make sure that that rule gets put in place. But it just so happens that that lines up with what the majority of people think. So that's the final example of where democracy might work. But again, that's not really democracy working. That's just giving the illusion of it's working. It just coincidentally happens to produce the thing that people want. So what we've gone through is that we've got this idea of democracy, this perfect democracy, that in theory is great, but in reality, not only is it an unreliable way of coming to the best outcome for the people involved, when it does come to the best outcome, it's usually other things that have caused that outcome, and we just incorrectly say that democracy has caused that thing. So why the hell do people actually like democracy and think it's this great system that's the best way of doing things? Because it's like, imagine you had a car that was just crap. It never got you to where you wanted to go to. Every time you took it to the garage, the mechanics just said, yeah, it's falling apart, it's terrible. It was always failing on you. It's like someone else coming up to you and saying, oh, have you thought about changing your car, getting a better one, upgrading it, something like that, and then you just say, no, it's perfect, I love it, it never does me any wrong. You would think that person is just like, there's something wrong with him, like, is there some weird attachment to the car, or is he just an idiot? But this is what we do with democracy, and there's what I think is a very clear reason for this, alongside some other minor reasons, like just simply being ignorant to everything I've talked about, or just not caring. The main reason I think that people think democracy is great is because people just simply want to have their say on how society is run. And I can understand that. It's not very nice if someone else tells you how you have to live your life, but there's tons of areas in society where we happily give up our decision-making abilities to someone more experienced, and we're happy with that. So any sort of medical procedure, I wouldn't make my own decisions on how I got operated on. I'd just say, I'm feeling ill, save me. And then the doctors would go ahead and make that decision. They put me on the right medication, and then we mostly just go along with it because we respect that sort of I guess authority and knowledge. We do the same for other professions like scientists and lawyers and engineers and things like that. So we don't really have a problem in these scenarios with acknowledging that we don't know what we're doing in this certain subject, so let's pass it over to someone who does know what they're doing. But for some reason we don't have this same kind of thinking with voting. We just think that's our right and I should be allowed to vote in any way I want to. And yes, you do have that right, but if the goal is to come up with the best outcome, then that is objectively not the best way of doing it. Just as if you went to surgery and said, I have the right to operate on my own body, which you do, it's your own body, but that's objectively not the best way of getting to the perfect scenario where you survive and you're completely fine. So we understand that when it comes to going to the doctors. But for democracy, with voting, if I said to you, for example, would you be willing to give up your vote and let someone else who was a lot more informed decide for you? You'd be outraged by that. And maybe some people would do it voluntarily. But say it was mandatory, or I don't know, semi-mandatory in some way. I don't know how that would actually exist, but some way where there was some kind of enforcement where, there you go, let's say, for example, if you didn't meet a certain threshold of information about a certain vote, then you couldn't vote and someone else had to vote for you based off of your lifestyle or something like that. People would go absolutely mental about that. People would go crazy about it. People would say it was a third world country and absolutely terrible. But we do that with other things like the anti-vaccine movement, for example. There's a serious conversation going on about should we take away the rights of uninformed parents because they are objectively producing damaging results. So uninformed parents think that there's something wrong with vaccines. They're not vaccinating their kids, and then their kids are getting sick. So you've got someone uninformed making what is arguably their decision to make, their right to make that decision. They're making that uninformed decision and creating objectively bad results. And there's a serious conversation where a lot of people are saying, no, we should take that right away from them because it's leading to a bad outcome. But if you take that exact same situation and apply it to democracy, where the majority of the country have voted based on ignorance or misinformation to do a certain thing, and that's objectively bad. And then the response to that was, okay, maybe we should change how we do voting so that certain people, if they aren't informed, they have to vote through a person who can more accurately vote for them. Then people will go crazy about that. So it seems like people like democracy purely because it enables them to have their opinion. And some people might say that's good, but if the goal is to get a better society for the majority of people in that society, then that's two different things. Everyone having an opinion does not necessarily lead to a better society. It's not, one thing doesn't follow the other. And I think a lot of people would probably argue as well that what other choice do we have? There's no better system that we know of than democracy at the moment, because all systems so far haven't been great. And it just so happens that whilst democracy isn't perfect, and it's not even close to perfect, it just happens to be better than the previous systems that have been around before. But a really interesting question that people need to ask themselves when they're thinking about whether democracy is the best way of doing things or not is, would you rather have a democracy that produced average or bad results, or a theocracy or a dictatorship that produced good results? And for me, the answer is somewhat obvious. I'd rather have a good dictatorship or theocracy than a bad democracy, because for me the goal is I want to make society better. And there's a whole bunch of ethical questions you can place around that, like is it better to do a good thing with bad intentions or a bad thing with good intentions, and things like that. But I'm not really that bothered about the ethical side of things now. I'm more bothered about the objective side of things. And if a dictatorship was objectively producing a better society for the majority of people, then I'd rather have that over democracy that was producing a crap society. But there's a lot of people that I imagine would have like a really visceral response to that, where it's almost like on a principle that they would rather have democracy because they don't want to be ruled over. And I get that, like from a sort of a human emotional standpoint. It's almost like, I guess, dying by your own hand is better than dying by someone else's, or something like that. And I don't think the answer is as simple as a good dictator is always better than a bad democracy. I don't think it's that simple, but at the same time, people who are saying that a bad democracy is always better than a good democracy, they're equally wrong. It's not, you can't say always like that. It's very nuanced and it depends on the situation. But as a sort of hypothetical, I think I prefer a good system, regardless of how it was run. So now we get onto the bit that I don't think many people really talk about, which is what's the next stage? Like, eventually we are going to realise that democracy doesn't work the way we need it to. And the only reason it's stayed around this long is because we don't have anything to replace it. We haven't really thought about anything. But I think there is something that you replace it with, and I have no idea if this is actually already a thing, but I've even made up my own term for it, and it's called, it's going to sound weird when I say it, but it's called Machinocracy. And basically it's where you use AI, because our AI technology is incredible at the moment, and 50, 100 years from now it's going to be, this AI, to be honest, is one of my biggest worries about the future. Global warming is number one, and AI, the progression of AI and the dangers of AI is number two. Everything else is just pretty much meaningless to me, like the economy and shit like that. It's so arbitrary that it doesn't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things. But AI is getting so powerful that, assuming we don't let AI destroy us like global warming is destroying us, we could have a system of what I call machinocracy, which is where we let AI decide what's best for us. And I know that people would, if you suggested that idea now, they would lock you up in an asylum, because people would think, the majority of the country would think that that's an absolutely crazy idea. But it's been shown time and time again that machines know us better than we know us, because machines aren't, at the moment anyway, machines aren't biased in that they have a particular incentive for a result to go out a certain way. Machines just simply take an input, some data, and then spit out a result. And if we want to say to them, machine, we want a society where everyone has a decent life and everyone is happy, the machine that would then be able to figure out, okay, what are the policies that people need to actually implement to do that? And then if we did that, it would solve some of the problems that I said in that original story of the two paths, because it doesn't matter whether humans are ignorant or not, because the machines are going to have enough data to be knowledgeable on the subjects. And machines also won't be influenced by lies that humans try to spin like they do nowadays. Whether this would be a successful way of doing the next ocracy, whatever that is, I don't know, because things could change so much over the next 50 to 100 years that AI could be so dangerous that they would just, the AI would just make policies to destroy us and give more power to the AI. So it could be like literally like a movie. But assuming the control we have over AI now, in my opinion, that would be a much better system for addressing the problems we have with democracy right now. But unfortunately, it's kind of like one of them catch-22 situations where machinocracy would have to be voted in by the very system that it's been voted in to replace, because that system doesn't work. So it's one of them things where you would have to get people to believe that democracy is so flawed that they want to replace the whole system entirely. And they'd have to use democracy to do that. So it's kind of weird, and I don't quite know how that would be justified. It would probably be one of them things where it would slowly go over time. So you might have the thing that I said 10 minutes ago, where you would have people, rather than a machine deciding how the society is run, a machine would decide how people's votes go, something like that. Or a machine would give you advice on how to vote or something like that. It'll probably be like a gradual thing that happens over time, if it happens at all, because people are so incredibly dumb and people are so incredibly married to the idea that they are definitely right and definitely know what they're talking about, which just definitely isn't the case. And before anyone says that's true of me as well, there's going to be a lot of things that I say that are wrong or ill-informed, and I think the only difference is that I really, really try hard to address those criticisms. So if people say I'm wrong, I want to know why I'm wrong, and I really try hard to try and address them things. Not perfectly, but as good as I can do. So we're coming towards the end of the episode now, and to sum up, we have decided that we want democracy because we think that democracy is going to be the best way to give us a society that has the best outcomes for the majority of people involved. But as we've talked about, that doesn't really work in practice. It might work in this theoretical world, but in reality it doesn't work because people are uninformed, people are easily swayed by people with bad intentions, so people end up voting based on misinformation, and that leads to objectively bad outcomes. And yes, sometimes it leads to good outcomes, but the control of them outcomes isn't driven by democracy. It's driven by people who control the flow of information influencing that democracy. So until the voters negate or take control of that flow of information, we don't have a democracy. It's not a real thing. It doesn't exist in reality. But there is a solution. We allow the decisions to be made by those who are more knowledgeable than us. And one option for that is machines, AI. But with that comes a whole bunch of unknowns because AI simply isn't fully understood yet. So in the next 100 years, as our stance on democracy evolves, the question might become, do we want to be happy slaves to machines or unhappy slaves to ourselves? So thanks for listening, and this has been the second episode of Let's Talk About, talking about democracy, and I've kind of enjoyed this one a little bit more because I've took my time a bit more with it, but I feel like I'm getting more of the hang of it, and maybe the audio quality is going to be a bit better, but it's still really weird, but I am enjoying it more and more as I do it. So if there is still someone listening, thank you for listening. And the next episode, which I'll probably do in about a fortnight or maybe 3 weeks depending on how time allows, the next episode is going to be about gender identity, which I don't think that's going to be a very long episode because honestly I don't think there's a lot to talk about. It's more just something that interests me because, and I'm going to put it out there straight away that people know, I'm 100% for LGBT rights and trans rights and things like that, but I think it's just interesting to think about what it actually means and how it's evolved over the last few years and how our understanding of what that means has evolved. But two, I think it's really interesting the way that people who are on the other side of it are really obsessed with the way people want to identify. It's quite simple, really, the concept, and I'll talk about it in a lot more depth in the next episode, but it's quite simple and people get really, really uptight about it and offended, and people think you're taking away their rights almost. It's really weird, but I find it really interesting and I want to talk about it just because it's becoming more mainstream and more widely accepted, and which I think is obviously a good thing. So next episode, which will be episode 3, talking about gender identity and trans rights and things like that. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope you tune in for the next one. See ya. Bye.